Welcome everyone to a new reaction series, probably the most requested reaction that I've had in the time that I've had this channel. And there's been a reason that I haven't gotten to it sooner. And some of you have heard me talk a little bit about this. Back in December, one of the very first reaction videos I ever did was to Epic History TV's video on the Battle of Austerlitz. In 4.5 years that I have had YouTube channels, whether it's my gaming channel or this one, I've only ever one time received a copyright strike, and it was because of that video. I never was given an explanation. I've seen other people do reactions to the video, so that's why I've been so hesitant to dive back into any of their stuff, particularly their Napoleonic War stuff, because if you get 3 of those copyright strikes, they delete your channel, and I would have to start over again. So copyright strike disappears after 3 months, so I'm back to 0. So I'm going to do 1 or 2 episodes of this and wait and see what happens, because last time it was 3 weeks before I got the copyright strike. I only had 1,200 views on the video, and so I reached out to them and they never gave me a reason why. So I'm hoping by changing the format a little bit, making it smaller, and making sure that I kind of break up the video a little bit will avoid that issue again. But just be prepared, I may not finish this series if that becomes an issue again. But this was overwhelmingly voted by our patrons to be the series you wanted me to do next, so we're going to dive into this. So I believe this series picks up in 1803 with what is generally considered to be the beginning of the Napoleonic Wars, the War of the Third Coalition. So the First Coalition, the Second Coalition are 1790s into the early couple of years of 1800s, and those are considered to be kind of during the French Revolution into the French Republic, before Napoleon becomes emperor in 1804. There was a peace treaty signed between France and England that ended the war of the Second Coalition. There's a time of peace in there before this third war picks up. So that's where we're going to kind of pick up the story. I don't think they give a lot of background on Napoleon, so just a couple of things about him for those who aren't familiar with Napoleon Bonaparte. He's born in Corsica, which is, if you're looking at the map, there's those 2 big islands that are to the west of mainland of Italy, and it's the top of those 2 islands. Corsica, the year that Napoleon was born, I think it was the year Napoleon was born, goes from being Italian to being French. I think it was Genoa that gave up the rights to it, and Napoleon was actually Italian by descent. His family was minor nobility from Italy, so he grows up speaking Italian and Corsican. I think he's only like 10 years old before he even starts learning to speak French, and that's when he goes to the French mainland to get a military education. He gets like a scholarship to a military school. His father is a lawyer who becomes Corsica's representative to the court of Louis XVI. So there's kind of some connection there. But yeah, Napoleon does not grow up French, and he does not grow up pro-French. His family's very pro-Corsican independence, and he was a part of that growing up. But he ends up becoming French. He ends up getting that military education. He's kind of this outsider, but he rises to power because of his ability. He demonstrates his ability time and time again as a brilliant tactician. While other people are failing, while other people are not doing as well, he rises to the top by his ability. So it's not about being an aristocrat. It's not because he's got the right background. It's because he's a brilliant military commander that he rises to power, and then he seizes the opportunity in a coup in 1799, I think it is. He comes back from kind of a failed campaign in Egypt, but his brother, who's a politician, is part of this, and they end up seizing power. He kind of does there's some parallels between him and Julius Caesar, where he kind of becomes first consul, but then seizes power all for himself. And that's kind of where we're going to be picking up the story as we dive into this. So make sure you check out the original video. I'll put a link in the description to Epic History TV's original part of this. I'm watching a video that's the entire thing, all 6 parts. So I don't know exactly where I'll stop, but we'll kind of stop at a good natural stopping point somewhere. Let's dive in.
An Epic History TV History March collaboration, supported by our sponsor, Osprey Publishing. In December 1804, in the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris, Napoleon Bonaparte crowned himself Emperor of the French. Europe had never seen such a sudden and dramatic rise to power. A son of impoverished Corsican nobility to military dictator of France in little more than 10 years.
And so at this point, Napoleon is, I think, in his early 30s. He's still pretty young. Remember, this whole thing takes place when Napoleon's in his 30s and early 40s. By the time he's my age, he's been overthrown and he's been exiled. I mean, it's an incredible life that he lives, and the things that he does at such a young age. And you're seeing, they're kind of showing some of the flashes of that, him crowning himself, the coup in 1799, some of the early battles of the second coalition that he was a part of.
Revolution and war had cleared Napoleon's path to the throne. War would dominate his 10-year reign. A conflict unprecedented in history that would leave millions dead and a continent in turmoil. Eight months after Napoleon's coronation, the French Empire and its Spanish ally were at war with Britain, and Napoleon had assembled an army of 180,000 men along the Channel coast. But as long as the British Royal Navy ruled the seas, invasion was impossible.
So here's one of multiple times throughout history when Britain's Navy saves their butts, because they would have been overwhelmed by this 180,000 man French army if they could just get across the Channel. That's a theme throughout history, right? I mean, going all the way back to the Spanish Armada in 1588, which was a huge navy that vastly outnumbered the English Navy at the time. Thinking of Operation Sea Lion, which was the never attempted plan by German forces in World War II to invade Britain. It just never happened. Time and time again, Britain, being an island, saves her, and this is another example of that.
But nor could Britain challenge France on land. And so British Prime Minister William Pitt tried to build a European coalition against Napoleon, using diplomacy and gold.
And I don't want to interrupt this often, but speaking of young people, William Pitt's another one. William Pitt the Younger, as he's known, is 24 years old when he becomes Prime Minister. I mean, think about what you were doing at 24. I know I was in no position to be leading a major world power as Prime Minister at the age of 24. I don't even think I'm in that position now, but it's an incredible accomplishment.
Britain would prove Napoleon's most steadfast enemy, and its press delighted in relentless mockery of the French emperor. Britain and France were old rivals in Europe and overseas, but now Pitt feared Napoleon's conquests had made France too powerful. The French emperor had to be defeated, and Europe's balance of power restored if there was ever to be lasting peace. Pitt found willing allies in Europe, among monarchs who despised Napoleon as a product of the French Revolution and a dangerous threat to the existing order. Austria harboured the deepest grievances, having seen her influence in Germany and Italy steadily eroded by French victories.
And not only that, but remember the Austrian princess, Marie Antoinette, who has just been executed about a decade earlier in the French Revolution. There was supposed to be an alliance there between France and Austria, and of course that is all blown up during the Revolution.
The final straw came in May 1805, when Napoleon had also crowned himself King of Italy in Milan. Austria, Russia, Sweden and Naples joined Britain in an alliance known as the Third Coalition, and devised an ambitious plan for a series of joint offensives against France. The main attack would be made by a combined Austro-Russian army, advancing across the Rhine into France. But Napoleon got word of their plans, and reacted with typical speed and decision. He was determined to strike first, before the Allies could join forces, and ordered his army, now renamed La Grande Armée, to march to the River Rhine.
So this is an important aspect of who Napoleon was, and it's something that is a trait that you will see in a lot of brilliant military commanders. Decisive action quickly. That doesn't mean that acting quickly is always the best course of action, but hesitating in making a decision can be fatal, especially when you're like Napoleon and you're actually outnumbered in a battle like Austerlitz. Making those quick decisions to get the advantage and to put your enemy in the position of having to respond to what you do rather than the other way around. Just one of many things that made Napoleon a brilliant commander.
His target was the Austrian army of General Mack, which had made a premature advance against Bavaria, a French ally, and was now dangerously isolated from the other Allied armies. Napoleon ordered Marshal Murat, his famously flamboyant cavalry commander, to make feint attacks through the Black Forest, while the rest of his army, advancing at speed, enveloped Mack's army from the north. That summer, Napoleon's Grande Armée was at its most formidable. Well-trained, highly motivated, its regiments at full strength. What's more, it had been newly reorganized according to the Corps system, later imitated by virtually every army in the world.
That's true, and in the United States, right about this time is when the United States starts the military academy at West Point. That was during Jefferson's administration, so that's happening right around the time this is going on. And one of the things that West Point does, this whole generation of officers that grow up attending West Point and that eventually become the men leading armies during the American Civil War, they're educated in Napoleonic warfare. This is the example that they're given. And of course, the American Civil War is the first time in American military history that you see large armies using the Corps system like this. And it was developed by Napoleon. And you can see parallels. Napoleon, because he develops these corps, he can they're like mini armies almost, and they can move independently of one another. And it's easier to supply, and it's easier to forage if you need to. And you see the same thing happening, for example, in the American Civil War, the Gettysburg campaign, where you have corps moving independently of each other. There's a lot of parallels here, and that's because those men were trained on Napoleon's tactics.
Each corps, commanded by a marshal, was a mini-army of 15 to 30,000 soldiers, with its own infantry, cavalry, artillery, and supporting arms, such as reconnaissance, engineers, and transport. This meant each corps could march and fight for a limited time independently.
Brilliant.
Allowing Napoleon to break with the old doctrine of keeping his army concentrated and advance with his corps widely dispersed. This helped to disguise his real objective and increased movement speed, because the army could advance along multiple roads and live off the land, taking its supplies from scattered villages, rather than relying on slow-moving supply wagons. When the enemy's main force was located, the army could quickly concentrate for battle. This is how Napoleon's army was able to move at a speed that often surprised and disorientated his enemies. Mack didn't realize the danger he was in until it was too late. Napoleon's fast-moving corps crossed the Danube behind him and surrounded his army. Mack launched a series of poorly coordinated counterattacks, but despite some desperate fighting, the Austrians couldn't break out of the trap. Mack hoped that Kutuzov's Russian army could arrive in time to save him, but the Russians were still 160 miles away.
And this is the story of the Napoleonic Wars, really. It's Napoleon hitting an army before they can bring the reinforcements up, before they can bring these, because you're fighting against various nations. It's a coalition with different agendas, with different commanders, with competing desire for authority and glory and power. And he uses that to his advantage for the most part, but it ends up biting him at Waterloo when it doesn't work out the way he'd hoped. But Napoleon is using his smaller, more agile force that can kind of make these quick movements to his advantage.
And so, at Ulm, on the 19th of October, just 6 weeks into the war, Mack surrendered his army to Napoleon. The French took nearly 60,000 Austrian prisoners, and Napoleon had struck his first devastating blow against the coalition. Russian General Mikhail Kutuzov was an experienced and wary commander, more cautious than Mack. His army was exhausted after its 900-mile march from Russia, but hearing of the Austrian...
Can we just stop and think about that for a second? A 900-mile march. I wonder how quickly they had to cover that ground. I mean, that is just an insane amount of ground to cover in the time that they probably covered it.
Surrender at Ulm, and knowing he wasn't strong enough to face Napoleon alone, he immediately ordered a retreat. Napoleon pursued. The Russians fought several sharp rearguard actions, but could not save the Austrian capital, Vienna, which the French occupied on the 12th of November. Kutuzov slipped away to Olmütz in today's Czech Republic, where he was joined by reinforcements, as well as Emperor Alexander of Russia and Emperor Francis of Austria in person. Napoleon was furious that Kutuzov had escaped. By now his army was also exhausted, and far from home, with winter approaching. He needed to force a decisive battle quickly.
And think about this for a second. How cool is this that when you get to the Battle of Austerlitz, you have 3 emperors present on the field. You've got the Emperor of Russia, the Emperor of Austria, and the Emperor of the French.
Fortunately for him, the overconfident 27-year-old Russian emperor sought the glory of battle, overriding the concerns of his veteran commander, General Kutuzov. With the Allied army closing in, Napoleon ordered his corps to rapidly concentrate on a battlefield he had carefully selected, near the town of Austerlitz. Napoleon oversaw the dispositions of his army late into the night, then grabbed a few hours' sleep beside a campfire. Dawn would mark the first anniversary of his coronation as emperor, and promised a battle that would make or break his young empire. The morning of the 2nd of December 1805 was cold and bright with a heavy mist. 2 armies of near equal size faced each other across a 7-mile wide battlefield. But the Allies held the high ground of the Pratzen Heights, while French Third Corps under Marshal Davout was still marching to the battlefield. Seeing Napoleon's thinly stretched right flank, the Allies planned a large-scale attack from the Pratzen Heights to steamroller the French right, before swinging round to envelop Napoleon's army.
Now, this is something they haven't learned yet, but if Napoleon's right flank is weak, there's a reason Napoleon's right flank is weak. He does not do this on purpose, or he doesn't do this by accident. He wants them, think about that. They've got the high ground. They've got the position that commands the battlefield. All they've got to do is make Napoleon attack them. But Napoleon knows that, and he wants to draw them out. And he actually told his generals, he said, if they move off the Pratzen Heights, we've got them beat. And that's exactly what happens.
Little did they know, Napoleon was counting on his weak right wing luring the Allies into just such a move. Whereupon he would launch his own attack on the Pratzen Heights, to cut the Allied army in half. His bold plan relied on his correct prediction of Allied movements, the speedy arrival of Davout's Third Corps on his right, and a perfectly timed counterattack.
Know your enemy.
The battle began around 7 a.m. as Austrian troops of General Kienmayer's advance guard clashed with French troops defending the village of Telnitz. In the face of overwhelming odds, the French fought stubbornly and bravely. But gradually, they were forced back.
Which they expected.
But the Allies, instead of carrying out their great enveloping attack, did nothing. The morning mist and the late arrival of orders had led to confusion and delay, and it was another hour before the first 3 Allied columns were on the move. Soon, fierce fighting erupted around Sokolnitz village and castle.
This is another difference between Napoleon and his opposing commander. When you're going to commit to an idea, commit to it. Go in full force. They come up with this plan, but then they don't even follow their own plan. They kind of haphazardly put people in. It's not well coordinated. So even in the event that Napoleon expected this, they still might have had a chance if they would have actually followed through on their attack, blown through the French right flank, and then come up around and hit the main body as they planned. But they don't even do that. So they basically play right into Napoleon's hands. This is not only about brilliant leadership by Napoleon and understanding his enemy and making plans to draw him into a trap. It's also about proper execution.
Marshal Davout's corps, which had just force-marched 70 miles in 2 days, now arrived to strengthen the French right wing. Around 9 a.m., his lead infantry brigade appeared suddenly through the mist and retook Telnitz, before being driven back in turn by Austrian hussars. 2 more of Davout's brigades reinforced French troops at Sokolnitz. As the mist began to clear, Napoleon saw that, as he'd hoped, the Allied left was moving off the Pratzen Heights, and he ordered Marshal Soult's 4th Corps to begin its attack. To the alarm of Allied commanders, 2 French infantry divisions, until now hidden by the mist, were suddenly seen advancing straight towards the Allied centre. General Kutuzov was forced to hurriedly organize a defense of the heights, using troops of 4 column. 2 hours of bloody fighting followed. Musket fire was so rapid and furious that both sides were soon low on ammunition and turned to the bayonet. By 11 a.m., the French, with the advantage in training and discipline, had secured the heights and driven a deep wedge into the Allied position. To the north, a giant cavalry battle developed. While a Russian force from General Bagration's advance guard captured the village of Bosenitz, before it was halted by cannon fire from the Santon Hill. A decisive charge by 6 regiments of French heavy cavalry finally drove back the Allies, allowing Marshal Lannes' 5 Corps to move forward and seize Blasowitz and Krug.
This is a huge battlefield. I don't know exactly what we're talking about here, but I've watched a couple of YouTube videos of people visiting the Austerlitz battlefield. The area in which this battle was fought is an enormous stretch of ground. I mean, it's almost like there are different battles going on in different areas that are almost independent of each other because it's so spread out. And this is, again, one of those reasons why Napoleon having the corps that he does, having separate corps with different marshals in charge, is such a great idea because it allows them to operate independently. And when he can't be directly in charge of what's happening, they are in position to kind of hold their own.
Now, Grand Duke Constantine, commanding the Russian Imperial Guard, led forward this last Allied reserve in a desperate bid to reclaim the Pratzen Heights. A battalion of the French 4th Line Regiment was charged down by Russian Guard cavalry, losing its Eagle standard in bloody fighting. Napoleon, who'd moved up to the heights, sent in his own Guard cavalry. In this grim melee between the elite horsemen of both armies, the French finally prevailed. Napoleon had broken the Allied centre.
Reserves left at this point.
Now, to close the trap on the Allied left wing, still locked in heavy fighting around Sokolnitz.
So the whole plan from the beginning was that this part of the battlefield was going to be where they broke through and then enveloped the French line, and it's just become a stalemate the whole time. So now they themselves are going to find themselves surrounded.
Around 2 p.m, Napoleon ordered 4 divisions to swing south and cut off their retreat. General Buxhowden, commanding the Allied left, only now saw the danger he was in. Attacked from 3 sides, the only escape was south. Many of his troops were forced to flee across frozen ponds. French artillery opened fire, trying to smash the ice with their cannonballs.
Wow.
About 200 men and dozens of horses drowned in the freezing water.
And I should mention, too, that one of the reasons why they chose to attack on the left, on the French right, is because, remember, France has just taken Vienna, and Vienna is to the south in that direction. So they wanted to be able to cut Napoleon off from lines of communication to Vienna. And so there was a strategic reason for going at him on that side.
But not the many thousands of Napoleon's propaganda. The French Emperor had won a brilliant victory. His army had taken more than 10,000 prisoners and captured 45 enemy standards. Thousands of dead and wounded of all sides littered the battlefield. Many left untended for days.
And I've actually seen, I don't know how reliable the sources are, but I've seen numbers that put the Allied prisoners somewhere closer to 20,000. So it just kind of depends on the source that you're reading on that information. That might have been Napoleon's source that said that. But remember, he had just previously captured 60,000 other prisoners. So it's a brilliant victory. It's very one-sided in terms of the casualties, no matter how you look at it.
The Battle of the Three Emperors, as it became known, was a crushing blow to the Third Coalition. As Russian forces retreated back to Russia, Francis I of Austria was forced to accept a humiliating settlement with France, agreeing to pay a 40 million franc indemnity and give up more territory in exchange for peace.
And Napoleon ends up divorcing his first wife and marrying a Austrian princess to kind of cement that alliance. And it's interesting to see then the parallel between him and Louis XVI in that. But we're going to wrap it up right there. I think that's a really good point to stop our first episode at the end of the Battle of Austerlitz here. Let me know your thoughts. Use the comment section below. We will come back with a part 2, and then I'll probably pause just to wait and see what happens, make sure everything's going to be okay. We'll do some other stuff in the meantime, and then we'll pick up after that. So hit that like button. Make sure you check out the original content. Epic History TV and History March have fantastic original content on their channels. I highly recommend that you subscribe to both of them. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again soon.